Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you today, talking about this work that we've been doing. I'll just tell you a couple of words about myself, but it's a long report, and I want to get through as much of it as we possibly can. I run a project called BIPOC Voices, and we work on different projects to help orchestras and opera companies to reduce the barriers to programming more diverse repertoire. So that's building demo recordings and creating demo recordings of pieces, building a database of works for vocal works because there wasn't any database when I started the project, doing this research here and doing many other things. The research that we're going to look at today is something that we've been working on for about 4 months. We analyzed the works of, or the programs, I should say, of Canada's orchestras, the 1920, 21, 22, and 2020, 22, 23 programs. And we were looking to see how these orchestras programmed female, trans, non-binary, and BIPOC artists, what the trends were, and what you would find when you slice the data a little bit more finely. We collected more than 100,000 data points. We collected information on more than 6,700 works which were performed, and we analyzed concerts from 72 different orchestras, and we'll get to what those were later. But that's sort of what this is that we're going to look at. There was at least 500 hours of work that went into creating this report, and I didn't do most of it. So I would like to thank this is me being honest. So I would like to thank all of these people. Particular thanks to Catherine Carlton and everybody at Orchestras Canada. Catherine was so excited when I started to talk to her about this project and has been extremely supportive all the way through. And thanks, of course, also to the Canada Council for the Arts who funded this work. So before we get into this question of what have we done, I want to take one quick moment and reflect on what are we trying to do. And there have been a lot of people who have touched on diversity in programming and other elements of diversity already today and in various sessions of the conference, so I don't want to spend a long time on this. But I want us to think about why diversity is important. And to me, there are two really big reasons, and this will sort of come up as we go through the analysis and think about what it means. So you might have your own different reasons, but these are two that are important for me. Number one, I think it's important that our seasons reflect our communities, and you've heard other people say that, right? And number two, I think it's important that we share diverse, let's say, perspectives. This could be artistic voices, this could be philosophies, this could be lived experiences. And so I think it's really important when we're thinking about diversifying our repertoire to ask, what does our target look like? What does our goal look like? We're going to get into some numbers in just a second, and you're going to see where we are as an industry as a whole. But it's important to think of, when we're seeing these numbers, are we 20% of the way to our goal? Are we 50% of the way to our goal? How much faster do we want to work? And I think, again, that there are very different and very reasonable answers to this question of what does success look like. But I just wanted to take a moment and sort of put that on the table and let you have that in your heads as we're looking through these numbers. So here's the good news. I'm going to start by giving you some really high-level overview of what we're doing, of what we found, and then we're going to break down two trends into smaller pieces. So the good news is that programming of equity-seeking composers increased by 63% between the 2019-2020 season and the 2022-2023 season. So when I say equity-seeking composers, I mean female, I've already said this, trans, non-binary, and BIPOC composers. It's important to note that in our entire research of I think there were 700 and some composers that were researched for this work. We didn't find a single one who self-identified as trans. So I don't believe that there was no music by composers who were trans. It's possible, but I don't think that's the most likely explanation. So as you're going to see with many of the facts that I'll share with you and many of the findings, this poses some interesting questions about what does that actually mean? Does it mean that there were composers who we're trans but don't identify publicly that way? Does it mean that we're just actually there were no trans composers? You know, there are many different sort of things to get into that get deeper into that. So this is the good news in a nutshell. The bad news is that 88% of music in 2022-23 was still composed by white men. So that means we're talking about the number of minutes of music that were played. So if you went into a random concert of a random group that we studied, a random orchestra, at a random point in the concert, there's an 88.3% chance that the music that's playing at that moment would be written by a white man. So we obviously still have a lot of work to do here. And we're going to sort of break down what those two figures look like. In 2019 and 2020, this figure of music by white men was 93%. So you can see that we're making progress, right? One other interesting thing we did, we wondered whether the budget of an organization was a meaningful predictor of how diverse its season was. It turns out that actually not at all. There was, if we look at the budget groups, and this is Orchestras Canada's budget groups, there were very, very similar trends across all budget groups. That doesn't actually mean there is variety in different ways within the budget groups. So in the lower two budget groups, I don't know if you can all read that on the screen clearly, this is under $500,000, this is $500,000 to $1 million. Those two budget groups showed the most diverse and the least diverse programming. In other words, they had the largest variance. So we found in 2022-23, which was the most diverse season that we studied, and which is, I think, fair to assume is probably the most diverse season that has ever been presented to a Canadian public. We found that there were 10 organizations we studied whose season was 100% white men. And of those 10 organizations, 9 of them were in the lowest budget category. But also, the top 3 organizations of the most diverse season all came in these two bottom categories. And then as we move up into the top categories, then we get much closer to the national average of 11.7% equity-seeking composers. Okay, so now those are sort of like the two trends that we're going to dig into. The good news, the progress we've made, and then also different ways to measure the progress that we still have to make. So chapter 2, we're going to dig into a little bit more specifically what this progress was. So here we're looking not just at equity-seeking composers, but specifically at BIPOC composers. Just a note on terminology, actually. Because a lot of the people I work with are in the States, I tend to use the word BIPOC, even though I personally prefer the word like IBPOC or BIPOC, depending how you say it. But it's all the same thing. So we see that there is a substantial increase, as we saw in the previous slide. If we look at female and non-binary composers, there's even a slightly larger increase of 77%. I say female and non-binary, we've grouped them together, which is not something we really wanted to do, but we had a challenge, which was that we did find several works by composers who identified as non-binary. But there were two challenges that we were presented. Number one was that the number was very small, so we couldn't put them on the same graphs as BIPOC and female composers because they would just be a little line on the bottom and you couldn't see them. And the second, more pressing, more worrying problem was that there were so few of them, which means they were so far from statistical significance that we were concerned that by presenting them as an independent group, we would just actually be presenting meaningless data, something that could be misleading. And so for those reasons, we've grouped female and non-binary, basically equity-seeking genders together. But we do recognize, of course, that women and non-binary people have very different paths to equity and very different experiences. Here we're looking at, we're going to see this data, and all of this, of course, is in the report, which you can find. It will be on our website, which is going to be on the end slide. So you can go and find this and read. The whole report is 70 pages, so you can read in a lot more detail after this. But this is the data. If we break down composers into living or deceased, BIPOC or white, and female/non-binary or male, then we can see how the data has changed from 1920 to 2023. We can see what the absolute change is, what percentage of the overall program, and what the relative change is relative to the 2019-2020 baseline. So there are a few things. I know this is not really meaningful to look at this in table format, but I want to highlight a few different things that jump out to me in this data. The first, you notice it says intersectional programming at the top, and so intersectionality here means that if you are a BIPOC person, you face a disadvantage when trying to get programmed. If you are a woman or a non-binary person, you face a disadvantage when you're trying to get programmed. And so if you're both, then you have an additional disadvantage. So here, if we look, we're just looking at living composers for this specific comparison. BIPOC male composers, about 22 hours of music in 22-23. Female non-binary white composers, about 21 hours in 22-23. And composers who are both female or non-binary and BIPOC, about 11 hours of music in 22-23. And then if we look at white male composers, it's 86 hours of music in 22-23. So this is one of the ways that we can start to see how the intersection of factors plays a role in what ends up happening in our programming. Something else to note here, this category, BIPOC, female or non-binary, and deceased composers saw a 2,500% increase, which sounds really amazing, but actually the only way that that can happen is because they only had 14 minutes of music played by that category in 1920, and so any increase is proportionally very huge. That's something to keep in mind when we're looking at all of these increases. As a matter of fact, if we look even back here at the female non-binary increase, you'll notice that the decrease in male composers is quite small, and the increase in equity-seeking composers is quite large, which just speaks to what a small number we started with in the equity-seeking composers to begin with. One last thing I'd like to point out on this table here. If we look, again, we're going to stay with just living composers. So we have BIPOC, female or non-binary composers, and then we have BIPOC male composers. They both experienced very similar relative changes, so 39% for female or non-binary and about 36% for male. But because the number of hours that were programmed in the baseline season was quite different, you see there are about twice as many for men as for women and non-binary composers, then by increasing them at the same rate, we're actually increasing the inequality. So here in 2019-2020, there were 7.5 hours more music programmed by men than by women and non-binary people in this category. I'm looking at these two numbers here. And in 22-23, there were 11 hours more by men than by women and non-binary people. So this is, there's a lot of different parts of inequality that can be hidden in the overall positive trend. So there is an overall positive trend, and I think it's there's some very serious faces in this room as we're going around and talking about this. I think it's very important to also keep in mind that there has been a lot of good work that's been done, that we're seeing change, and we're going in the right direction. And this work to me is a question of digging down into, okay, so if we're seeing overall change, what specific parts of that can we be doing better in? In the actual report, this is also represented visually because I know that's a lot easier to sort of see. And so here's the 19-20 season, and here's the 22-23 season, and you can sort of compare those side by side. Yeah. We're now going to take a dive into chapter 4. We're going slightly out of order in the report because as I said, it's long and I want to make sure we get to the most important stuff first. So chapter 4 is the areas, how we think about the work that we still have to do. So what's the most obvious way that I can express to you how much imbalance we still have in our programming? We spent the same amount of time playing Handel and Beethoven as all equity-seeking composers in our most diverse season study. So there's not a lot of explanation for that. That's what it is. So that's where we are right now. If we break this down into BIPOC, and then we'll look at gender seeking equities afterwards, let's look at the Canadian population. So this is this data up here. According to Statistics Canada, 33.2% of Canadians identify as being BIPOC. Well, that's not the word they use, but if we translate, this year in 2023. And as we've seen earlier, despite a significant increase, 6.5% of the music that we played this year was by BIPOC creators. So to think about that more specifically, we would need to program 5.1 times more music by BIPOC creators for us to reach sort of parity with demographic data. Now, I think it's interesting at this point to stop and think about, is our goal to reach parity with demographic data? You know, and here I'm not going to try to give an answer for you. It's an answer you have to find for yourself. Obviously, different parts of the country have very different demographics. And I think this is an interesting question because even if your organization is in a very, very white part of the country, I mentioned at the beginning that there are two reasons that are particularly valuable to me to diversify repertoire. One of them is so that people feel included, so that your season represents the demographics of your area. But the other is to include a plurality of voices, to include different experiences and different, this can be musical voices, this can be experiences. And even if you're living, I think, in a very white area, there's a lot of value, there's a lot to be said for bringing a richness of just different voices, different styles of music, different approaches to your audience. And so that's why I think this question of what is a target is a very, let's say, ambiguous one that has a lot of reasonable answers to it. I'll just point out also that the change, we've heard about changing demographics. I was just in the previous session and, I've heard this comes up a lot. The rate of change, because some of you may not know this, in Canada, we're becoming about 0.5% more BIPOC every year, or 5% more BIPOC over a 10-year period. So that means, if you are doing strategic planning and looking maybe 5 years out and you're programming a year or two in advance, this number, 33%, could be 36%, 37%, as we're looking at long-term sort of horizons. And it's projected to go up to, by 2041, Stats Canada projects that Canada will be 46.9% BIPOC. So again, that will be spread out differently in different places, but it's, I think, interesting to think about what the long-term implications of this kind of work are. We're going to break down that previous slide here. This slide is just looking at the number of times the pieces were programmed. So basically, how many times a BIPOC composer's name gets put in the program versus a white composer. And so you can see that there's obviously a very positive trend here. This is the percentage of works that are by a BIPOC composer. This is not including length. But the 9.9% in the most recent season here is still far from the 33.2% of our actual population. So one question that I like to think about is how long, let's just suppose that our goal was to reach parity with our demographic data. How long would that take at the current rate that we're going? And then is it acceptable to us, and again, this is, you make your own conclusions, is it acceptable to us to take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to get to the places that we want to with our programming goals? And if it's not, then what can we do to address that? This graph is looking at the length of a piece. So the average length of a piece programmed by a BIPOC composer and the average length of a piece composed by a white composer. And we see that the numbers vary, but the average is about 80% as long for a BIPOC composer. So from these two graphs together, we can get back to this one here, that when you have composers who are programmed less often, and when they are programmed, their works are shorter, that's how we get this 6.5% of works of music, which is by BIPOC composers. And if we look at a similar analysis for female and non-binary composers, you'll see that we're still have a lot of work to do here. We need to program 6.8 times more music by female and non-binary composers to reach parity with our audience. And again, I think the question bears asking, do we actually want a season which is half by women? Does that mean that every time we perform a Mahler symphony, we have to perform a whole hour of music by women? And how do we feel about that? And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm not saying we should. I think different organizations will place themselves differently inside of this question, but I think the question bears considering seriously. Also a note on the non-binary stats. The 2021 Canadian census was the first census of any country in the world to report on non-binary people. According to that census, 0.14% of Canadians identified as non-binary. A couple of interesting notes about that. One is that anecdotally, from speaking with several non-binary friends, there was some concern about how the census was done, and I think there were some people who identify as non-binary who were maybe not reporting that because they were not sure maybe how the data would be used or exactly, So we can expect that this number may rise in subsequent surveys. The other interesting fact is that Gen Z and millennials were 7 times more likely to identify as non-binary or trans than older generations. So we can also expect that over time, the number of people who are identifying that way will rise. Now, this is still, granted, a reasonably small percentage of the population, but I think it's interesting to think about what that actually represents and the direction that's going in. So if we move over here to look at the number of times that pieces were composed by female or non-binary composers, again, we can see there's a positive trend. And again, we can see that the 11.2% in 2022-23 is far from the 50.8% of the population which identifies as female or non-binary. And similarly, we do even worse in comparing we compare the lengths of work written by women and composers who identify as non-binary, and their works are on average 69.1% as long as the works of their male counterparts. So again, these two, it's exactly the same. It's very interesting to me in doing this work to see how similarly BIPOC composers, the stats for BIPOC composers, paralleled the stats for female and non-binary composers. There were a few important differences, but in very general terms, there was a lot of similarity between those two data sets, and I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it was something definitely interesting to notice. Here are the top 5 composers that we programmed in the 22-23 season, along with the top 5 BIPOC composers and the top 5 female composers. You'll notice here that I say female and not female non-binary. I don't know if you can read all that very clearly, but it will also be, if you look in the report afterwards, you'll be able to see it a little bit better. We had a challenge when dealing with non-binary composers because there has been so much, I don't know what word to use, but backwards conservative legislation happening in these states around gender expression, around other things, that we were legitimately concerned about publishing the names of non-binary composers who might not wish to be publicly known as non-binary. And so in any place in this report that we've published actual names of composers, we have left out non-binary composers, so it's just female composers. And this was a decision that we came to in consulting with our team. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but the research team, between the research team and the consultants we hired, there were at least 2 people who identified as each of BIPOC, female, trans, and non-binary, so that when we had issues, we would have a variety of people to speak to, and we did hire other consultants also when we felt that we needed a little bit more depth. So that was what we decided was the best unfortunate way of dealing with that situation for now. Okay, now we're jumping back to chapter 3. This is a little bit more positive. We ran a bunch of analyses to look at places that we expected that we might find bias, and we didn't find it. So these next slides are all about the places that we thought that there might be inequalities, and they were minimal or sort of not very present. The first is looking at what month BIPOC composers were programmed in. So do we just program BIPOC composers in Black History Month or Asian American Pacific Islander Month? And as you can see, the data is very chaotic, and there are no real serious trends except that BIPOC composers tail off in December, presumably because we're all playing Messiah.
Which is why it's Handel's number 1.
Yeah, that's exactly why Handel's number 1, yes. But other than that, there are no real clear trends in this data. So we can say that we're not relegating BIPOC composers to just February when Black History Month is, or just May when Asian American Pacific Islander Month is. We also looked at female composers to see, are we mostly performing female composers on International Women's Day, which is in March 8th, I believe. Yes, 8th. You'll notice that in 21-22, that was the month that we had the most female composers. Of the 3 seasons that we analyzed, 21-22 was a sort of outlier in, I would say, more than half of the analyses we ran, and this won't shock anybody in this room. So I think that we can be optimistic that this data point may be an outlier also, but it's something that we'll continue to track to make sure this isn't a trend. But you can see also the data is reasonably chaotic here, so it's this does not seem to be an issue at this time. Were equity-seeking composers programmed less on main season concerts than on other concerts? Now, this is challenging because different organizations describe main seasons in different ways. We chose the term main season after some discussion. It might be taken to mean some people might call it masterworks. We don't like that term. But obviously some organizations, their whole season is their main season. Others have different sorts of distinguishers. So there is some degree of inconsistency in how these were coded, but we were still trying to look to see, are we putting mostly this type of composer in this space or that space? And as you can see from the data, there's not a huge difference. So that's not something that we would consider to be a big problem or a big inconsistency. And we also looked to see, for those composers, was there a difference in the amount of time, in the length of works that were programmed, whether they were on the main season or on other concerts? And again, you can see that the difference in time is pretty small. In both these cases, there is a slight lean towards other concerts, but I wouldn't consider it a very large lean. So that was interesting. We looked to see, are BIPOC composers programmed differently in primary and secondary venues? So this is similar to main season and other concerts, but it's just a different way of breaking it down. It's also a little bit more clear. And you can see that they're programmed at almost exactly the same rate in primary and secondary venues. Tour, there were not a lot of pieces that were qualified as tour, so this number looks bigger, but that might be explained by the fact that there's just a lot less data in that column, so it's less accurate. So generally speaking, we can say that we didn't find any substantial differences between primary and secondary venues. And the same thing goes for female and non-binary composers, very consistent again across primary and secondary venues. I'm sure that there's a lot of variation if we broke this down organization by organization, but it was very encouraging actually to see that many of these places we thought there might be bias. There was not any sort of substantial amount of bias. Right. So what should we do with this information then? One of our partners for this project was the Institute for Composer Diversity, who some of you may have seen their report last year. They did a report on American orchestras, which was the inspiration for this work. So this is very similar to that. We went a little bit deeper in a couple of categories, but they're also repeating that work this year. And one of the things that came out of their report last year, I was at the session where Rob Deemer was presenting that, and he said, we really hope that this trend isn't a flash in the pan. We hope that this goes up and that this keeps going up. And so I was speaking with them about the research that they're doing this year, and though they're not quite finished their analysis, he shared with me that none of the major trends that they've been following have been reversed this year. So that's a positive thing. We are planning on, and we're submitting grant requests to do further research here For example, we took 2019, 2020 to be a sort of standard pre-pandemic season. We would like to study one or two more seasons to see if that's actually true, to get a little bit more detail. And also next year we'll have a second sort of post-lockdown season that we can study, so we'll have a little bit more definition there. So I think one of the things we can do with this data is sort of digest it and understand how we fit into it. You know, as I said before, there is quite a wide variety of organizations in terms of what percentage of your seasons is equity-seeking composers. And I'm sure that for any one of these analyses we ran, there's a wide variety also in your organization. You have somewhat different mandates, you have somewhat different goals. And so to think about how you fit into this and what parts of this progress you feel you're well positioned to address. I think, to me, the most interesting part of this is that there are a lot of questions which are posed by this data. If we say that either BIPOC or female and non-binary composers, their works are shorter when we program them, why is that? And what can we do about that? Does that mean that when they're commissioned, they get shorter commissions, so the works they have are just shorter? Does that mean that there are other systematic reasons that they, you know, I could make something up, but there are any number of systematic reasons that they're writing shorter works? Does it mean that they have works that are exactly the same length, but we're choosing shorter works? And if that's the case, why? What is, you know, where is the pressure coming from? Where are the decisions coming from? And I think there are a lot of questions posed by this data. And I would really like to encourage you, you know, I'm sure that everybody who's here in this session is here because they're interested in doing this work. Otherwise, I don't know why you would have just sat through that. So, you know, I think it's important, again, and I said this already, but to go back to, we've made progress. You know, we've made measurable progress. We've made important progress. And if we want to continue making progress, you know, the better we can understand the problem, the more effectively we can address it, right? So we can choose, you know, maybe I want to think about the types of commissions that I'm giving and, you know, what sort of pieces are being created and what's the legacy of that. Maybe I want to focus just on raising the number of pieces by equity-seeking composers, and that's like a relatively easy thing for me to, you know, and so again, like I'm not actually working in an orchestra, so I don't have these answers, but, you know, I would really encourage you to think about that. Now, there are 4 appendices that are in this report. The first one, if any of you were in the last session, I sort of talked about this one. The first one is a list of all of the works that we found that were by a BIPOC or female composers. So in the 3 seasons that we studied, there are, I don't have the number in front of me, but I want to say 700 and something works by equity-seeking composers, and we have made a list of them, so you can just sort of go through. All of these pieces have been programmed at least once by a Canadian orchestra, and you can go through and just sort of like use that as a resource. We've included the timings if we have them. We don't have the timings for all the pieces, but we've done our best. We have also put together a list of every work by a BIPOC composer and a separate list of every work by a female composer. Whoops, excuse me. That's the wrong place. Did I just put up the wrong slide? Oh, we'll get there. Every work by a BIPOC composer and every work by a female composer that was programmed more than 3 times. The number 3 is kind of meaningless, but we had to put a cutoff somewhere, and we wanted just to put things, you know, not that had been done once, but that people found value in. And this is what I was referring to when I was talking about if you had, in the question in the previous session over here, if you have, I don't know, somebody in marketing, somebody on the board, somebody who is in your organization who is resistant to this, give them this playlist and just assign them this listening. And this, I mean, the number of amazing pieces here, which I didn't know before this, it's just like hit after hit after hit. And so, you know, we hope that you can use this not only as a tool in your own programming, but also as a way to talk to people who might have some resistance about this change in programming. You see, we also have one for female composers, and again, no non-binary composers named here, unfortunately. So this is a tool that we hope that you're going to use. And then, of course, if you see a composer that you like, then you can go back and find more works that they have in this next list that that have been done. So we hope that you'll use this as a resource. I'm going to end with the second appendix. So again, I'm going to jump out of order a little bit. Appendix 4 is just talking about our research methodology. I think it's really important to acknowledge how we've done this work. And it's, if you want to get deeply into it, it's also important for you to understand, like, what do these numbers mean? When we say a composer is BIPOC, what does that actually mean? Where do you draw the lines around this sort of stuff? And so we've started off with a list of all the organizations that were included in the research. We don't talk about specific organizations by name in the report at all, but we did want to acknowledge 3 organizations that had the most diverse seasons in 22-23, and those are these 3. So Spree Orchestra had 39% of their programming was by equity-seeking composers. Ottawa Symphony Orchestra had 37, and Sudbury Symphony Orchestra had 35. And I think this is important, and actually, if you're interested in how your organization is doing, please come and talk to me. I've built a tool that I can use, so this is obviously not going to be public, but I'm happy to talk to you about it, to look at how your data breaks down against the national averages. And I was speaking with Taras at the back earlier there, and the Orchestre Classique de Montréal was actually 4th on this list, and he didn't realize that. And I think it's really important to be able to brag to your donors, brag to your funders. This is a really important part of what this work is. If you're doing good work, that should be recognized, right? And I don't know if these people in these orchestras know that they're doing the best in Canada or not. So we would like to acknowledge that. And then further on in this appendix, we also talk about where the data comes from, how we did our research, and that sort of stuff. Appendix 3 is we collected data on living composers because it helped us in our analysis. Something I didn't say earlier, actually. Living composers, the works of living composers are just shorter than the works of deceased composers on average. I think it's like 64% as long or something like that. So when we were doing the analyses of how long are female non-binary or BIPOC composers versus their non-equity seeking counterparts, that was only for living composers, to get rid of that already baked bias that many more of the male white composers are deceased and are, we're not programming Mahler type works from very many living composers today. But so we had this data on living composers, so we decided to run the same analysis on it. It's not the focus of this report, which is why it wasn't included in the main graphics. But if you're interested, we answer all the same questions for living composers, how they're programmed as we did earlier up in the report, so you can read up on that. And then Appendix 2, which I sort of wanted to end with, is my favorite one actually, because Appendix 2 is where we talk about, it's actually a personal essay that I've written, it's not sort of as objective, and it's about what it was like to do this work. So I've spoken to a lot of people who are interested in diversifying, who don't always know what the next step is, or who have concerns about maybe being called out for doing things in a way which is not optimal, or many different concerns of people who want to do the work and are not quite sure. And so our hope with this appendix was to talk transparently about some of the ways that this research wasn't as good as it could be, some of the ways that we ran into problems that we weren't sure if we found the best solution. And in doing that, to do 2 things. One, just to sort of like walk people through what it was like for us. And we had, including our consultants, a team of 9 people working on this who was extremely diverse. And so, if you're working on this by yourself, with one other person, with 2 other people, and you have less diversity, this is going to be harder, right? So I'm not going to talk through the entire appendix here, but there are a few things that I'd like to point out. The first consensus from our researchers was that they found, they were sitting there spending hours and hours. I think there were about 325 hours of research went into this work, and they just listened to a lot of the music that they were researching. And they all said they found a ton of music that was really great that they didn't know. So I think that's just, off the top. This is one really great takeaway, and we can talk about, morally or from the perspective of funding bodies or any of that sort of stuff, why we might want to do this sort of work. But I think the number one thing comes down to there's actually just a ton of really good music, that there's no reason that we're not programming. The next thing that was a consensus among the researchers is that it was really valuable to have meetings. It was, not everybody always loves meetings, but it was really valuable to have meetings where we could talk openly about what we weren't sure about. So one of the researchers said it really beautifully. She said, I am an expert on my type of minority. I'm an immigrant, I'm BIPOC, I know all about that, but I don't know anything about being trans or anything about being non-binary. But we had people in the meetings and we could just talk really openly about this. I think that this sort of work almost necessitates community. I think it's extremely, A, it's ineffective, but B, it's extremely difficult to do this sort of work well in isolation in small groups. And the more people that we can be speaking with and sort of listening to, and that includes, making sure that we're listening to them in an environment where we're bending over backwards to make it safe to speak, safe to bring their whole selves to the conversation, and that we're demonstrably acting on the things that they say. And when we did that, we did find that there were no challenges that we couldn't come up with some sort of solution to. And I have to say, really honestly, if I were doing this work with one other person, for sure there are things that I would have done that somebody would have taken issue with. And even so, there probably are still things we've done that somebody will take issue with, and that's fine. I'm happy to talk to them about it. I'll give you a concrete example. I wrote something somewhere in the report where I was talking about the term non-binary, and I know that a lot of different people use different terminology to express their gender. And so I said that we use the term non-binary in the broadest possible sense to mean people that don't, the people who identify outside of the binary of male and female. And one of my non-binary researchers said it would be much more inclusive to say outside of a binary of male and female. And it was so reflexive for me to say "the." It was a little word that didn't make any sense, but to them, and I so see this as soon as they said this to me, it's just a more inclusive. There was no way I could get to that, right? So I think that there's no substitute for community and for open listening when we're doing this work. Yeah, I think that's basically all that I want to share with you about this report. The last thing that I'll say is that the reason that we wrote it and presented it, and especially this last appendix that I was just talking about, we want feedback. The feedback can be it was useful, or it would be more useful if it did this. The feedback can also be I didn't like the way you did this. To me, doing this work, again, I just said community, the bigger the community that we can build, and the easier it is for me, and the more quickly I can sort of do this in the way, that's useful for you as administrators. Because our whole goal at BIPOC Voices is to do work that can be leveraged by other people so that we can do it once and other people can all take that and go on and achieve the things that you're trying to achieve. So if you have any comments, please reach out to me. The report will be published this evening at the website that you can see here. And so you can go through the whole thing in more detail and download it there. Thank you for listening, and I would now love to have any questions that you might have on everything on the way that we went through. Yes?
I'll just move, so I feel weird asking you a question when I can't see your face. I'm pretty sure this is outside the scope of this study, but have you looked into training institutions that train composers and what those numbers look like diversity-wise? Because I sort of fear that if those numbers are similar to what we're seeing here, that we're not really going to progress over time.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it sort of gets down to what's the point of attack that's going to have the greatest benefit. Absolutely. So that is outside the scope of this report. We haven't done any research on that. I can speak anecdotally to my time at McGill and to what I teach at McGill now, and it's kind of what you would expect. There's not as much diversity as we might like on the BIPOC front, but I don't have any hard data for you on that. I wish I did, because it's a very good point, and I'm sure that there's something meaningful, and then this gets deeper into like admissions process, or do we have to go back before, and it gets complicated, but it's a great question. Thanks. Yes, please.
Do you happen to have any data of diversity within periods? Like, for example, if we talk about the Baroque, it's very hard to program non-white composers because there's not any, or basically very little non-white composers. So when we look at the Baroque season, well, yeah, the data is going to show that, but do we have any kind of, like any research on that you have done or that you came across? Like, I can think of maybe non-binary, for example, maybe people were not identifying in non-binary in the 17th century, so how can we program a non-binary composer who are doing that type of music? Do we have any kind of statistics or a database where we could be like, oh, there is a couple of, composers there that we could kind of try to look more into? Or
Yeah, I have two things that I'll say to that. Number one is that we didn't look at that, but I did notice some organizations, exactly as you predict, who focus on older music, largely Baroque, and unsurprisingly, their seasons are extremely white, because who are you going to program? I'm not saying they don't exist, but I don't know them, or not in large numbers, right? I forgot the second thing I was going to say. You said, do we have data on? Oh, on time periods. Yeah. I think that we collected a variety of different parameters for each work and each composer, and we didn't end up using all of them in detail, but we wanted to be able to slice the data different ways. We collected composers, but we didn't sort of go through and find their dates. But this is like readily available information. So that would be a really interesting way of slicing the data in the next report, to just sort of see how that shows up. And that might go into chapter 3 of like, oh, hey, this didn't make a big difference, or rather it didn't fall much outside of what we would expect. But I think that this is why it's so important to sort of define as an organization what your goals are. If you're an organization that does music from every period, then it might not be a big deal that, there are not a lot of BIPOC or female Baroque composers. And to the point of non-binary, I should also say that you can read this in the report, but when we were doing our best to ascertain the ethnic and gender identities of deceased composers, we obviously had to use different methodology than for living composers. And so, yes, all deceased composers were assumed to be cis, even though that's probably not the case. There was an interesting case of Ernaldo Hahn, who was born in Venezuela. And I was speaking to a Venezuelan friend anecdotally, and I asked her, do Venezuelans consider Hahn to be Venezuelan? And she said, yes, absolutely. And I was like, but if you look at Wikipedia, and I know this is Wikipedia, but I did look at Wikipedia, and on his father's side, I believe his father immigrated from Europe and his mother's grandparents immigrated from Europe, and his music doesn't sound particularly Venezuelan, so I sort of like pressed her a little bit further on this. And she said, well, I don't I said, do you know of anything of like him speaking about himself as a Venezuelan? And this is all completely anecdotal, but she said, no, I actually can't. And so this is like decidedly gray area, you know. So there is that degree, as you say, even within historical composers, it's just like really hard that there are probably people that will never know, if they probably didn't even think of it this way, but if by today's standard they identified outside the binary, or even white passing composers who just didn't advertise the fact that they weren't white. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just have a comment to maybe
Please.
add to it. Early Music Vancouver has a really interesting take on what early music is, and which includes Indigenous music from not just North America, but other cultures as well. So you might want to check that out, because it is a really fascinating take on early music programming. What we typically think of as Baroque and Renaissance.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and this is a really interesting point, because we have all these frameworks that we sort of don't challenge, right? And I don't say that actually as a negative critique. That's just how we are as humans, right? And I think there is a lot of opportunity sometimes when we can find interesting and productive ways to break those frameworks and to say, oh, but actually, this could mean something different, and it could be just as artistically viable, or maybe more so. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. So, if we have an orchestra attending here today and looking at these numbers and thinking, well, we can do better and we should do better, what would be a good first step that you recommend for them to get started?
I think the first step all comes down to defining really clearly what you're trying to do. So to do that by itself might be a challenge. That might require speaking to some other people, sort of bouncing ideas off people. So this could be other administrators, this could be me, this could be consultants that you hire. But to try to understand specifically what you're trying to do and what the value is to you. Because when you have a target, we've seen lots of up and to the right trends here, which is great and I'm very happy about. And then there's sort of like no end point. So as I say, is this a rate of progress that we're happy with? Do we feel that we're going to sort of like get there in a reasonable time frame? Or do we want to be taking more aggressive action? And then of course, we have to also talk about what are the challenges of taking more aggressive action, and are there any sort of ways to mitigate some of the potential downsides, because those are real also. So I would say that the first step, if you feel that you're doing what you can and don't know what more to do, is reach out to me, talk to your fellow administrators, and really just have some conversations to try to get as much clarity as you can around what that goal looks like for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. If you think of things later, find me. I mean, I love talking about this sort of stuff. And the whole point of BIPOC Voices, as I said before, is to do work that can help other organizations. We do a tiny bit of programming, but basically we don't do any programming. We're here sort of as a support organization. So talk to me and tell me how we can help you. Thank you.